Hello again. We continue with our discussion on causal analyses for outcome evaluations. In a previous video, we talked about what we mean when we say that something causes something else using the nomothetic causality model. We discussed that under the nomothetic causality model, we are focused on generalizations about a population and not on explaining a single case, right? Under the nomothetic causality model, when applied to evaluation, we're trying to say or to look for whether program participation caused some outcome, right? We also discussed the three criteria for nomothetic causality. These are the three conditions that must be met for us to conclude that something caused something else. We said that under the criteria for nomothetic causality, to say that some variable X caused some outcome Y, we need to establish that there is a relationship between variable X and outcome Y, right? We also need to establish if X caused Y, then X had to be there before Y, right? And third, we need to establish that this relationship between X and Y is not explained by some third variable that is sort of associated with both of these X and Y and explaining this association. In the world of evaluation, when we apply these criteria for nomothetic causality, we need to prove, right, to prove the first one, we need to prove that there is statistically significant difference between participants and non-participants, right? This is what would allow us to see if there's a relationship between participation and some outcome, right? We also have to prove that the difference between participants and non-participants was not there before the intervention, right? If the difference was there before the intervention, then we cannot say that the program caused this difference. And third, we need to prove that the difference between participants and non-participants is not explained by some characteristic of participants that is related to both the likelihood of program participation and the outcome, right? So in evaluation, causal analyses, right, we need to prove these three things to say that the program caused some outcome. We need to prove a difference between participants and non-participants. We need to prove that the difference was not there before the program. And we need to prove that this difference is not explained by some characteristic of program participants that caused both them to be in the program and also some difference in the outcome. Now, we said that there is a way to do this. And we discussed in a previous lecture that the best way to do this, to prove these three conditions, is by using the randomized controlled trial design. We said that the randomized controlled trial is the gold standard of research designs to evaluate causality. At that time, we just took this as a given. But now we have the tools to understand why the randomized controlled trial is the gold standard. And more importantly, we have the tools to understand what would happen if we use some type of different design that was not the randomized controlled trial design. Now we will understand why evidence-based clearinghouses consider the randomized controlled trial as the gold standard, and in some cases will not even look at other evaluation designs. Let's recap how an experiment works. Here you have on your screen the steps in an experiment and the components of an experiment, right? In step one, participants are randomly assigned into treatment and control groups. This is a key component of an RCT. In step two, both the treatment group and the control group are tested, right? We are tested with an outcome measure. We see what the outcome is before the intervention, in other words. Then in step 3, participants get the treatment. They get this intervention, or the treatment group gets the intervention. The control group can be business as usual. Nothing happens with them or out of the ordinary. And in step 4, when the intervention is already completed, both the treatment group and the control group are tested again in a post-test on that outcome measure. After they're tested, we look at the difference between treatment group and control group in the change of this outcome variable. If the treatment group has a different outcome measure than the control group, then we can say that the intervention caused this difference. And this difference in difference is called the treatment effect. Right? So why does an experiment work? Why is it that we can just attribute causality when we use a randomized control trial? Well, it's because of these 3 key components of a randomized control trial, right? The first one is the control group. It's a key component. The second one is a pre and a post test. And the third key component is the random assignment into groups. To see why these 3 components are key in assessing this causality, let's think about what would happen if we are missing these components. First, why do we need a control group? Right? Well, the control group, if you think about it, allows us to make comparisons of outcomes for program participants versus non-participants. Right? If there was no control group, then we would not be able to see how participants would have done in the absence of an intervention. Right? In evaluation research, the outcomes for a comparison group are called the counterfactual. So a counterfactual is this outcome for a comparison group. So what would an experiment, or how would a research look without a control group? It would look like something like this. And this is called the one group pre and post test design. Right? In this design, you don't have a control group, but you do have a pre and post test. And you may or may not have a random assignment into a treatment group. Well, the evaluations that look at outcomes just for the program participants cannot assess if the program really caused the outcome, right? Because this design doesn't have a valid counterfactual, it doesn't have a comparison of outcomes for people who did not get the treatment, right? It is impossible to estimate how much participant gains can be attributed to the program, right? Imagine if you just observe the treatment group, right? And you may see some changes in them, right? From the pre to the post, but you cannot say if these changes are due to the intervention. Maybe the entire population changed, right? Maybe everybody else changed at a higher pace than our intervention group, right? So maybe we actually hurt our participants in some way, but we don't know that. We cannot. We don't know that because we don't have a control group. We don't have a valid counterfactual. We don't have any other group to compare our results with. So we would not be able to assess if there is a statistically significant difference between participants and no participants. Now we turn to the second component. Why do we have a pretest? Right? The pretest allows us to compare the outcome measures for treatment and control group before the intervention, right? So it allows us to make sure that the difference in outcomes between the treatment and control groups were not there before the intervention, right? And this is a key component in the criteria for nomothetic causality. So imagine an experiment with no pretest, no random assignment, where you just have the treatment group and the control group, right? Because this design has no pretest, we don't know if the difference between the treatment and control group was there or not before the intervention. So it is not possible to assess causality with this design. We need that pretest so that we can compare the outcome measure for treatment and control groups before the intervention, so that we can make sure that these differences were attributed to the treatment, right? After the treatment was completed. Now, the third component is having random assignment, and this is one of the hardest to implement, but it's also one of the most important ones, because the random assignment into control and treatment groups allows us to make sure that there are no characteristics of program participants that are related to both participation in the program and the program outcomes, right? Imagine in random assignment, participants are not selecting themselves into an intervention, right? It's random, right? A computer is selecting them into participation or not participation, right? When people choose to participate in a program, what is making them choose to participate may make them different to non-participants. And we may never observe really what is it that is making them choose to be in the program. And that may also be related to the chances that they will have a higher outcome, right? After the intervention than non-participants, right? So when participants select themselves into participation, we may end up with a situation where we're comparing apples to oranges at the end, right? Those that selected themselves may be very different in many ways that we cannot observe than those that did not, or that chose not to be in the intervention, right? So we end up with an invalid counterfactual. So, and we cannot rule out the possibility that the differences are there just from some other characteristic of participants, right? This design, where we have a treatment group and a control group, and we have a pre-test and a post-test, but no random assignment, is called the non-equivalent comparison group design. Now, it's very tempting to take the results of a study with this type of design, because it's very similar to that of a randomized controlled trial, but because it doesn't have the random assignment into groups, it is impossible to rule out the differences in groups that might explain the differences in outcomes, right? So it is not possible to assess causality with this design, right? The non-equivalent group design looks very similar, like I said, to a randomized controlled trial, in the sense that we will be able to look at difference between control group and treatment group, or comparison group and treatment group, and also to assess if the differences were there before the intervention or not. But it does not allow us to control for that third condition of normothetic causality, right? It does not allow us to rule out the possibility that these observed differences are a function of some other characteristic of participants that we couldn't observe. So when participants are allowed to self-select into an intervention or control group, for that matter, we will always have this problem. So now, experiments work because when you have a well-designed experiment, it allows you to get these three conditions of normothetic causality. It allows you to have a statistically significant, or measure if there is a statistically significant difference between participants and non-participants because of the control group. It allows you to rule out the possibility that the difference was there before the intervention because you have pre-test and post-test. And it allows you to rule out the possibility that this difference is explained by some other third variable or some other characteristic in participants because you have random assignment, right? That's why an experiment works. But sometimes, even when you have a well-designed experiment, things can go wrong, right? Or sometimes it is impractical to implement a randomized controlled trial because excluding people from participation may be unethical or even in some cases illegal, right? You cannot deny services just because you're conducting an experiment. But even if you can, in some instances, sometimes it is not practical to separate participants from non-participants. If they live close by, and those in the control group know what the participants are getting, then may copy them, or they may just feel demoralized because they're not part of it. And so you start having all these other variables play into the experiment and into participants' behavior that may make things not so clear. Also, in the problem in real life experiments dealing with real interventions, some people may leave the intervention, right, or the control group. And while the assignment into the groups may have been random, the decision to leave the program may not be random, right? Some people may be deciding to leave the program for some reason that may be related to the outcome. So you end up with a situation when you have a high number of people leaving the treatment group or the control group. You may end up with the same problem of having a non-equivalent comparison group, even if you started with a correct random assignment. If a lot of people leave the experiment or the control group, you may end up with a non-valid control group. So in summary, in order to establish that a program caused an outcome, right, we need to make sure that the three conditions are present, right? That there is a statistically significant difference in outcomes between participants and non-participants, that the difference was not there before the program, and that there is no other participant characteristic that explain both program participation and program outcomes. The randomized controlled trial allows us to do this because of three key components it has. It has control groups, it has pre-test and post-test, and it has random assignments into group. However, implementing randomized controlled trial designs can be impractical or impossible in many settings. Sometimes, right, if we are having a social program, for example, excluding people from a treatment may not be practical. Or we may get sued. It may be illegal to do that, right? To deny services to a group. It may not happen. So it is not easy to implement these randomized controlled trials, as you may imagine. We need large groups of people into control and treatment groups, and sometimes that's not feasible. But some other times, opportunities present themselves in the form of natural experiments. And these are situations when participants are enrolled into a group and control group and other participants are not enrolled to a group, and this enrollment is not, it may be a random or not a decision of participants or non-participants. And in this case, we have something similar to a random assignment that allows us to compare this and have a valid counterfactual. So sometimes experiments present themselves naturally. But the experiment, the randomized controlled trial, as we have learned, is still the gold standard for assessing causality. And these other three designs, the one group pre-post comparison design, or the an equivalent group, or the one-shot pre-experimental designs. They are still used, but you know the problems with them now. You may be able to explain now why they have shortcomings, why it's so hard, or why it's impossible really to attribute causality when you don't have a full experimental design. I will see you in the next video where we will talk about how to apply this into an outcome evaluation. Thank you for watching. See you then.